Hey, what's up? It's Jim, and I just got back from the new film Sound City. It is a documentary about the famous Sound City Studios, which recorded many a famous album using the Neve soundboard, which was specially made by Robert Neve, this recording engineer who made an amazing board. And through that board, he recorded classic albums like Fleetwood Mac's Rumors, Nirvana's Nevermind, and recorded albums from various other famous rock bands such as Neil Young. Fleetwood Mac recorded several albums there: Pat Benatar, Santana, REO Speedwagon, Nirvana, Blind Melon, Weezer, Fear, Rat, Cheap Trick, Grateful Dead, the Red Hot Chili Peppers, Rancid, Johnny Cash, Foo Fighters, Queens of the Stone Age, A Perfect Circle, Bad Religion, Nine Inch Nails, Metallica, Elvis Costello, Arctic Monkeys, Rage Against the Machine recorded their first album there, Tool recorded there. The list goes on. And it was a classic studio, and they had this amazing board that they got in the 70s. And the first thing they recorded on there was actually Lindsey Buckingham and Stevie Nicks' first album before they joined Fleetwood Mac, and it was kind of, that studio was instrumental in how they became part of Fleetwood Mac. And then its history through the 70s to the 80s, when the studio actually signed Rick Springfield to a production deal and made him a star. Now he eventually left, and the whole sordid history of the studio from when it started in the 70s till when it closed. And Dave Grohl, who directed this film, bought the board and brought it to his own home studio. The documentary for 70 minutes goes through the history of Sound City to becoming what they're doing in the present, with them making this album with people like Paul McCartney and Stevie Nicks and the lead singer of Fear and Trent Reznor and various people who worked with that board, and how they're making this album and how they want to do it because they all feel that this soundboard was a part of what made them who they are today. And the way Dave Grohl directs this is kind of erratic. He kind of has a spastic energy to what he's doing when he's directing, and for the most part when he's showing the history of Sound City and how important the board is and using analog technology and using tape, I think he does a really good job. And it's like, you never really get bored of it, you know, even though it is made in the typical documentary fashion. He does a fairly good job in keeping it actually pretty cinematic. Even though I watched this through iTunes on my computer, it still had a very cinematic way about it. So it would have been a really cool documentary to see in the theater, because he cuts around between old video footage and pictures and interviews of all these guys who worked in the studio and famous musicians who recorded albums in the studio. So you really get a good sense of the studio, but you also are like totally engaged in the viewer because of the way Grohl directed it. Now I think kind of that erratic nature and how spastic and fun it is works for the most part, but then there's a part in it where he's interviewing Robert Neve, who created the Neve board, which is kind of the reason he made the film, because he bought this Neve board and how it's so important to this studio and everything. And most of the time when Dave Grohl is interviewing a subject, it's just them by themselves. They never cut back to him like it's a news story or something. And then for the Robert Neve thing, it does cut back to him, which was jarring anyway. And then it has these jokes in it like, oh, this guy's talking because he knows I dropped out of high school and stuff like that. And that I just didn't think really worked, and I didn't think it was really that funny. And it's also like, why are you disrespecting the guy who made the board, who's basically the basis of why you're making this film? You want people to respect this board, but you're not going to respect the guy who actually is the one who made the board and made the technology to make the board. Just seemed like counterintuitive and didn't really work with what he was doing. I didn't really understand why he did something like that. It seemed like, whoa, you're actually hurting your own movie here. I don't know why he did something like that. The first 70 minutes, when it's about the history of Sound City and everything that happened and their history with Rick Springfield and the advent of digital recording and how it started with Fleetwood Mac, and then people started using Sound City in the 80s, and then when digital recording came in, it kind of fell off, and then suddenly Nevermind was recorded there and everyone wanted to record there, and then how it eventually kind of all fell apart. They kind of get into like the passion behind that room and the passion behind recording in that way, and then the film kind of takes a very big shift, and it almost feels like it doesn't work at the beginning when he shifts to his home studio where he brought the Neve board and put it in his home studio. And at the beginning of that, in the recording with Stevie Nicks and the recording with a couple of people, they record with Rick Springfield, And at first, the Rick Springfield part is kind of the transition to when I really start to get into this section of the film a lot more. Because at first, I'm like, I don't get it. I understand you wanted to make this record and you're kind of trying to sell this record with this documentary. And that's fine, and it sounds okay, but I'm not that into it. It's so jarringly different from the rest of the film I've been watching. And then, as the film keeps going, and then you see the part with him and Josh Homme from Queens of the Stone Age, and Trent Reznor and Dave Grohl are recording, and that part's interesting because they talk about how Trent Reznor uses both the analog and the digital as like different kind of instruments, and how that was very interesting. And then when they get into the part where it's like all those surviving members of Nirvana, it's like Chris Novoselic and Pat Smear and Dave Grohl and then Paul McCartney. And that part I think was really great. And it was probably the best song of the newer stuff that they were playing. But it was also all the musicians, talking heads that they have start cutting in and talking about their passion for playing. And Dave Grohl starts talking about how the Beatles is how he got into music, and how he says earlier how Nirvana was really influenced by the Beatles. And then he's playing with Paul McCartney, and they keep going to these talking heads. And it started to really make me turn, and they really tried to show me like the passion and why these people wanted to record on analog, and their passion behind it, and their passion to playing this way, and their passion for creating art. It's really about them playing music and rock music, but even the enthusiasm that these guys fucking have for making music made me think about just making art and making your own shit. And that enthusiasm is kind of like infectious when it's at the end. It's like brimming out at the top. You can't keep it in. It like made me want to go and do something creative after that. I mean, I'm making this video. I don't know if that's as creative to some people, but to me that's like I'm doing something creatively, and it like inspired me. It gave me like kind of a passion to fucking do it. It was a cool documentary because not only did he show the history of this studio and why the studio was so great, but he also showed kind of why all these people wanted to get into music. And I think in certain ways he shows that the board is important, but also that the human element is almost even more important. It's a pretty well-made documentary. Dave Grohl kind of goes a little too far sometimes, but for the most part I think he did a fairly good job with it. And it's probably one of the better music documentaries I've seen in a while. It's got an interesting story to it, and it was a fun watch, and it left me kind of inspired. I think that's a good feeling to leave with a documentary, especially about rock music, that you feel inspired to do your own shit, whether it's music or art or whatever. So if you have seen Sound City and you would like to talk about it, then comment below in the comments, and subscribe if you would like to.